John has been awarded a Chevalier de Merit for his services to the French community and French government, and an Order of Australia AM for services to the community of the Northern Territory in a range of public sector roles supporting the administration of justice and through sporting, church and Indigenous welfare organisations. I'd now like John to come up and reminisce a little about the early days of Nullarbor.
Hey, Flynn!
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ross. Lynn Walker, the local member, and fellow guests. Obviously, 40 years ago, I didn't think I'd be here this evening, but I'm delighted to be here, and it's given me an opportunity to to think about what happened 30, 40 years ago. The town wasn't sort of officially open, but it was a sort of a combination thing between the plant and the town, and that was 40 years ago. And it was a huge day. There were two DC-9 jets at the airport. William McMahon, the Prime Minister, flew in a RAF jet, and there were, I'd say, a dozen other planes. My recollection was that the event was so big that there just wasn't accommodation here for the visitors, and most of them stayed in Cairns, so they came from Cairns that day and then went back that evening. Visitors included the whole of the CSR board and many board members of the minor shareholders of Gove Alumina, who in total with CSR own 30% of the project. There were of course the board members of Aluswis, led by Mr Meyer, the chairman. There are other dignitaries which included representatives of the contractors, government people, the Northern Territory Administrator, Fred Cheney, the press. My humble task was to attend upon the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of the Department of Territories. I was instructed by Alan Coogan, the site manager, to glean any territory information that might be useful to Nabalco from this pair. As it turned out, I seemed to know more about the territory than they did. I knew more about the legislative proposals. There are a couple of interesting things, and I don't really want to denigrate a past Prime Minister, but when he got off the plane, he saw the Swiss flag flying, and the first thing he said to Alan Coogan was, "What's the Red Cross got to do with this place?" And then later on, Coogan took him and his wife through the plant, which is, pretty spectacular, and the central control room. And then at the end of it, Mr McMahon said to Coogan, he said, "Where's the factory?" So he must have thought they were making aluminium boats or something here. Anyway, how did I get here? It was an interesting story. I was 2IC in the Registrar General's office, and in walked Eddie Notter and Nabalco solicitor Henry Heron. And they wanted to know how entrepreneurs in Gove could be given title to land. They had absolutely no idea how to sort of dissect Special Purpose Lease 214. I said to them, look, if they came back the following day, I'd have a solution for them. I went and saw the then Surveyor General Peter Wells, who said that he'd be prepared to authorise private surveys, which was quite unusual, and then sign them off as being authorised surveys. So and then the Registrar General, after I had consultations with him, said he would accept in leases just the reference to the authorised survey and the lot number. So I had a letter ready for Eddie Notter and Nabalco solicitor Henry Heron when they came in next day, so they thought that this was all pretty good, and they said come and have lunch. So Eddie Notter was a pretty smart fellow, and he said, you could be useful for us in Gove. So that's how I ended up in the town office. Alan Black was the town administrator, and I can remember he took me for an explanatory look over the town. He showed me a large concrete slab, I'll never forget this, and said that was to be the club, and it would be completed within 2 months, and I was responsible for ensuring that it was opened with a licence. Just to see the slab there and say it's going to be completed in 2 months really opened my eyes. I thought it was impossible. Anyway, at one stage I'd been the clerk of the licensing court, and so it was easy enough for me to arrange the appropriate licence, which was a transfer from the club in Nhulunbuy South. I might say at the same time, it was a bit later on that I arranged the licence for the golf club, and I also had a fair hand in organising the Bank of New South Wales demountable that had been the bank at Mount Saunders. So that was the original clubhouse for the golf club. The construction was unbelievable. It started in February 1969. When I came here, there were 3,000 workers at the Wallaby Beach camp and 3,000 workers at Mount Saunders. People worked for 10 hours, a minimum of 10 hours a day, and only had Sundays off. Workers were in 3x3 rooms, two to a room, and it was surprising that there was so little industrial strife given those conditions. The whole project cost a bit over $300 million, and as Tim O'Neill said, the town cost $45 million. It was incredible that the whole project could have been built so quickly at such a cost. And if you consider that there was absolutely no infrastructure here at all, the only two things that it had going for it was the Mission Jetty, which was just about falling apart, and the other thing was the airfield, which had been, a good airfield really constructed during wartime. Anyway, one of the things that sort of amazed me at one stage, the whole town and all the yards and the houses were landscaped, and lawn seed was sprayed everywhere almost overnight in about a week, so the whole place took on a green, it was all green anyway. That was because the mulch in which the seed was had been dyed green. Each house had about 10 shrubs which came from the nursery or trees. One of my responsibilities was to assist and encourage private enterprise people to come to Gove, which was pretty difficult at that stage. One of the huge difficulties was the housing accommodation, because whilst Nabalco had provided a number of lots for private enterprise people, they wanted $8,000 for the lot, and if you built a house those days, it would have cost at least $40,000, which in today's term is probably over $1 million. So for a small shop owner, perhaps a sports store, to have to fork out that sort of money, it wasn't justifiable. I can remember working until I'll go back a bit. The only place that looked to be viable to me was Contractors Village. The contractors were entitled to put on an allocation basis houses for their senior employees there. And they also had to put sewerage, electricity and water services there. But the arrangement with all the contractors was that when they finished their contracts, they had to take away the buildings, the houses that they had there, and just leave the ground back to where it started. But it seemed to me to be a bit of a waste, and that was the only way, in my view, that private enterprise could ever start in Gove, was for those contracts just to sell their houses for $4,000 or $5,000, or up to $15,000, I think, for some of the asking prices. And I can remember working until about 3 o'clock in the morning to prepare a board submission to get the board to agree to the proposal that we'd retain Contractors Village, on the basis that those people that bought blocks there would have to make a contribution up to $4,000 for the upgrading of the services. Anyway, that's how Contractors Village started, and that was really a boost to get private enterprise into Gove. During construction, obviously, there wasn't much recreational activity apart from a couple of boozers, one at Mount Saunders and one at Wallaby Beach. There were open-air picture theatres, and cricket was played on borrow pits. That's about all I can remember. It was quite amazing, the enthusiasm of the new Nabalco operations people. As soon as they got to town, and the tennis courts had been constructed, the bowling green was there, constructed. It was amazing the way that the new construction people really got into making the town into a really functioning town, playing sport, being on committees, organising everything. It really happened in less than a year, you know. And everybody contributed, and it was really fantastic. Now, before when I first came here, the only way you could get in touch with the outside world was a telex machine, mail obviously, and I think there were 4 radio telephones, and anybody that's ever used a radio telephone would know how hopeless they were. Then it was great when the PMG put what was called a tropospheric scatter on a hill out on the left-hand side on the way out to the airport, that suddenly we could use normal telephones. And it was only, I think that was probably about 1973, and it was only maybe a year after that that you could make STD calls, and the ABC radio had been connected to the tropospheric scatter, or they had something here that connected it up, so we actually had a access to the radio. But that was short-lived. That all happened, the STD calls and the radio happened about three months before Cyclone Tracy. So the facility connecting the tropospheric scatter in Darwin was blown away. So we were back to no phone calls, no phone calls, no ABC radio, and you just got this monotonous bit of music on the radio to say, sorry, there's been a breakdown and we'll be back on air shortly. That went on for month after month. But the day after the cyclone, I knew what had happened in Darwin, and I got one of the PMG technicians to allow me to talk. I was town administrator at that time, to talk on the radio. They could connect. It had never been used before, but I was able to talk, and I explained as much as I knew about Darwin, and said that we were taking up collections in the town office for relief for those that were badly hurt financially. I could not believe the response from this town, and it wasn't as though they were most of the people that had come really hadn't come from the Territory, they were from down south, but the response to Cyclone Tracy for the people in Darwin was absolutely outstanding. I just couldn't believe. I was staggered by the generosity of the Gove people. I might say that part of the establishment of these sporting organisations and so on was helped a lot by Dr. Walter Copel, who had taken over from Alan Coogan as the general manager. But I don't know whether you'd remembered reading James Bond's stories. One of the villains was Dr. No. And Dr. Copel, because he was always so generous when anybody asked for anything, he was known as Dr. Yes. So I thought that was pretty complimentary. Walter Copel, for those that might have known him, died about 3 or 4 months ago. He really enjoyed Darwin, and when he packed up and left, half his container was filled up with eucalypt leaves. And I think about 10 years ago, I visited him and stayed at a holiday house of his, and he cooked a barbecue, and he still had some of these eucalypt leaves left, which he put on the barbecue, so it was just like being back home. So it's not... There were all sorts of things in setting up a town, and I even thought of it as I walked past the post office today, that I can remember them arguing about whether there would be a postal service here, and the PMG, as the post office was then known, just wanted to have the boxes at the post office rather than a delivery service. And then they wanted to charge for the boxes, and we said, well, if you don't deliver that, like you would anywhere else in Australia, you shouldn't be charging for the boxes. And as my memory was, in the end they caved in and they didn't charge for boxes. I don't know whether they charge these days or not. One of my early jobs was to get the cemetery registered, which is actually off the town lease. And I was a bit horrified at the time because, coming to a place like this, I thought if anybody died, they'd be put in a box and they'd put on an aircraft and buried somewhere else. But anyway, we got the cemetery registered, and unfortunately it wasn't too long after the cemetery was registered that we had a couple of deaths, and I don't know whether any of you remember Buffalo, David Tate was killed, and he was one of the first buried there. He was unfortunate. His wife worked at the hospital and they had a small child, so it was a very sad day. I think one of the next blokes buried there was a bloke by the name of Noel Mackenzie, who was probably one of Gove's earlier villains. I think he'd probably worked for the painters and dockers and that sort of come here to get out of the road. Anyway, poor old Mackenzie died, and we buried him, and I'll never forget, he was buried from the Catholic Church, and Father Corrie was said such nice things about him. A lot of us didn't think it was Mackenzie in the box. I did in fact go to the cemetery this morning, and would have known half the people that have been actually buried there. And one thing that really struck me, that this is a real decent, solid town, is that there are husbands and wives buried in that cemetery. I won't mention them all, but there was Harry Fincham and his wife Joy, Maury Radford the surveyor and his wife Beryl. And it also reminds me that there are many children that have been born in the hospital here that have now married locally and had children now going to school. So it's really built up a real town with tradition and people with a knowledge of the town. I'll tell you a couple of stories. Usually industrial strife isn't all that much fun, and there have been a couple of big strikes here, and I was involved in one that went for a couple of months. But when I was a town administrator, Oil Can Harry and John Groom, who some of you might know, came to me one Thursday afternoon and said, we're going on strike tomorrow, just for the day, because the Nabalco people who work next door to us in the industrial area have award negotiations going on shortly, and they're going on strike, and we thought we'd join them in support. And so I said to them, I knew they were great fishermen and they just wanted a long weekend. So I said, is there anything that needs to be done tomorrow? If everything's okay, have a good day's fishing. Anyway, on Monday, Oil Can came in and said, they are still on strike, so we're still on strike. So that didn't impress me at all. So next morning I got in touch with Oil Can and I said to him and John Groom, and I said, look, you've got no reason to be on strike. You've got there's nothing that against the corporation. If you don't come to work, as far as I'm concerned, you've just abandoned your employment, and you can come and collect your final checks. I didn't tell him at the time that I'd get in touch with the Commission straight away, and that the Commission would obviously order their reinstatement and order them back to work. But I didn't mention that. But it was only about an hour after that, Harry said, look, we've organised a union meeting. Will you come along and, tell the men what the story is? So I went up, in the nursery, I can remember, and Oil Can was there, and the corporation employees were there, and Oil Can said, we're very lucky to have John Flynn, the town administrator, here. Is if he wasn't here, his hand would be the fountain pen would be in his hand, and he'd be signing our final checks. And so I explained to them that they had no gripe with the corporation, and that they were just abandoning their employment. So they resolved to come back to work. Apart from one of them who said he'd never been to a union meeting where the boss was there, and that was a chap by the name of Ken Harvey, and I really liked Ken. He was a plumber, but anyway, he abandoned his employment and he left. The other amusing story was I was responsible for transport later when I worked for Nabalco, and on one occasion a grader that belonged to the brickworks had rolled over out near Yacala somewhere, and they wanted it, well, it had fallen down over something or other, and they wanted a crane, a Nabalco crane, to lift it back onto the road, and they asked us to do it. So I said to the transport blokes, you'll do it, and they'd have to use a crane from inside the plant. But there were no riggers at all in the transport union. And I said, how about taking one of the chemical workers who was a rigger, just to make sure that it's safe to lift it. And they said, oh no, it's a demarcation. The chemical workers work in the plant, and we're not going to have one of those. We'll do it. So I wasn't happy with that, and said to the union bloke, I said, look, you're just a mob of prima donnas. So the bloke rang me back about 5 minutes later, and he said, I've been talking to my members, and they don't like being called prima donnas, and we're going on strike for 2 days. So the amazing thing was that they then called themselves the prima donnas for years after that. But I think they were a bit ahead of themselves, because I was reading the other day something a bit similar, that the women rowing eights, there was some doubt as to whether they would go in the Olympics in London in a month's time, and somebody described them as a motley mob, and so they've ever since been known as the motley mob. So it's a bit like the prima donnas. Chris Hindle took over from me as town administrator, and I took on commercial, took over the commercial responsibilities for Nabalco. I can distinctly remember walking into my office into my old office on Monday morning, just to give Chris a bit of a handover. He'd changed the whole office around. He had photographs and his own paraphernalia, and it was a completely different office. Chris was so keen to be the town administrator, and he was he really had his heart in this town, and I was delighted to know that an oval had been named after him, because he was really a well-deserving town administrator, and we were certainly Gove was, or Nhulunbuy was certainly very lucky to have him. I might just say that John Flynn Drive in the industrial area isn't named after me. It's named after the Reverend John Flynn. And you might know that further down the road there's a road, I think, called Traeger Street or something. And Traeger was the man that developed the pedal radio for the flying doctor service. So that John Flynn certainly isn't me, although a number of people have said it was named after me. It's not, and normally it's not. The sort of nomenclature rules are such in the Northern Territory that you don't name things after people that are still alive. There were lots of good people that worked for Nabalco that went on to brighter and bigger things. I suppose Jim, or now James Strong as he was known, he was an industrial officer when I was first here. He's done a lot of things, and now he's the chairman of Woolworths, and he's also chairman of IGA, an insurance, IAG, one of the biggest insurance companies in Australia. And Galarrwuy Yunupingu worked for the corporation for a while, and he ended up the Australian of the Year. I often think, if I look at Woolworths now, that Jim doesn't remember where he came from, because Woolworths here could do with a bit of sprucing up, I reckon. Steve Hatton was another industrial officer. He ended up as the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory. I'll tell you a story about the rehabilitation work here. After I was town administrator for a while, there was no need for the continuation of the nursery. All that work had been done, and Dieter Hinz was the man that ran the nursery. And it was my unfortunate job to tell him one day that he'd have to start looking for another job because we were closing the nursery, and he didn't take too kindly to it, because I thought I think he thought he had a job for life. I can't remember exactly, but I know he wasn't too pleased. It was only about 3 or 4 days later that, and you'll find this quite incredible, that Duke Dirtling, who was the operations manager, rang me up and wanted to see me, and I went to see him, and he said, under the terms of Special Mineral Lease 11, there's a provision there that we've got to rehabilitate the area that we've mined out, and it's got to be done to the satisfaction of the government. He said, what have we got to do to satisfy them? And I said, look, I really don't know. And he said, next time you go to Darwin, can you make some inquiries? And this was probably 2 years after, the mining had actually started. So I went to Darwin. I didn't want to make, too big a noise about it anywhere. And I spoke to a chap, Tony Hooper. His wife later on became, I think, the high school headmistress here at one stage. And Tony Hooper said to me, he said, look, I think, what you should do is you should get somebody to start doing some rehabilitation work with a bit of knowledge about trees and plants. And he said, once you do a bit of rehabilitation work, you'll be the expert, so we can't really tell you what to do. So I told this to Duke Dirtling and said, look, why don't you get in touch with Dieter, because, he's just sort of lost his job with the corporation, and take him on. So Dieter Hinz did a magnificent job for Nabalco and has since become a real world authority on rehabilitation work. But you can, if you got a mining lease these days, it just wouldn't say you've got to rehabilitate it to the satisfaction of the government. There'd be 90 pages of stuff, I would imagine. So that was a rather interesting little exercise that I was involved in. There was, and I look forward today, when I was in the town office and signs were being put up around the town, there was a walkway which goes between the sort of far side of the Catholic Church up to Dryandra Street. And it was known as Mawallen Walk. And Mawallen was one of the most, probably the earliest famous bark painter from this area. I don't know which clan he was with. We put the sign up, and it was only a few days after we'd put the sign up that some Aboriginals came into the office and said, look, that man, he's passed away, you can't have his name. So we took his name down, and it was only a few days later that some of his closer relatives, I think from the right clan, came and said, look, where's the name gone? And we said, we've taken it down. And they said, oh, no, we want it back. So we put it back. And I went to look for it today, but I can still, there's the 2 posts there, but there's not the name. So, but I'm sure it was there probably even 5 years ago. So, and I've got a bit of an attachment to Mawallen, not that I ever knew him, but my father in the early 60s took him to and 2 other Aboriginals from the Northern Territory to the Royal Sydney Show, where they put on their artistic skills for the people of Sydney, and apparently they were quite a great hit. Just as a matter of interest, you probably don't know what the names of the roads in Nullarbor South are named after. They're all named after Swiss subsidiaries. And I was told tonight there's a sort of a North Arnhem, historical society, and they've actually put out a little book about the names of various, or the explanations for names. So if people are interested in the town and the names, that book would obviously be of interest. The only thing I had any involvement in naming was the town hall. I can remember there was a discussion about 3 or 4 of us as to what name the town hall should be given. And anyway, there were various names suggested, and I said, look, this is pretty hopeless, because whatever name you're given, it's always going to be known as the town hall. So it never got a name, so it's still the town hall. So I'm responsible for that bit of naming. I'm a Catholic, and I was sort of involved in every Wednesday night, which was a real pain, calling bingo. And I think bingo's only stopped a few years ago, but it was pretty good for the Catholic Church for about 40 years, I think. It was a good money spinner. But, when you're calling those days, you could be calling in a way that wouldn't be acceptable today. So you'd say, you know, two fat ladies, 88, Diana Dawes, 44. If you don't know what the 44 is, it was Diana Dawes' bra size, and you know, legs 11 and a wolf whistle and that sort of stuff. But I'm told these days you can't do that. And one night I thought I'd be a bit clever, so I thought I'd put a bit of a Christian effort into the thing. So I'd say True God 1, I do Trinity 3, Apostles 12, I think Decades of the Rosary or something, and Days in the Desert 40. And I was quite surprised. I thought I was being clever, that these women, that ardent bingo players, came up and they were pretty disgusted with my calling, so I reverted back to the bullseye 50 stuff and 77 Sunset Strip. One of the things, and Klaus will mention this, is the building of the Catholic Church. Most of the Catholic Church fell off the back of a truck. Father Corrie was the priest. And, the contractors were very generous in providing, I'm only joking that it fell off the back of the truck, but they're pretty generous in providing, material for the church and using their labour. In fact, Father Corrie was absolutely disgusted after the church was built, because he told me that the car park had cost more than the church. And the car park had been put down by some Italian contractors and supposedly good Catholics, and that had cost more than the rest of the church. I'd finally like to say that I really enjoyed my time in Gove. They're great people, just as you all are here this evening. You've been so welcoming. I met Catherine she was a commercial pilot and was flying through Gove, and I actually met her in the Walkabout Hotel. We were married in 73. We had four children born in the hospital here, so we had a record for a while. Catherine really loved the place so much. She died 5 years ago, and her wish was that her ashes be scattered between the town and Wallaby Beach, and in fact that was done. And I really enjoyed the place so much that when I die, that's my wish, that my ashes be scattered over the town, so I'll have a lasting presence on the Gove Peninsula. I'd suggest we toast the town and its people, so if you'll all be upstanding. Null Boy and the great people of the town.